taking a little bit of a different approach today because I'm talking, first of all, really specifically about my intermediate students, so my grade 10 students. And the reason for that is in high school the only chance we are guaranteed to have them. And so I think at that stage it's really important for us to prepare them for some of the amazing things that then they can be capable of doing in simulations or in their senior classes when they choose to come back. And the sad thing about the curriculum is that grade 10 Canadian history is the only time they must take Canadian history in secondary school. They do have a grade 7 and 8 Canadian history experience, which is varied depending on the school that they go to and the teacher that they have in their senior years of elementary school. But in terms of the secondary situation, our skill set is the only thing that transfers to grade 11 and 12. The content is irrelevant, really. I mean, it's hopeful that they walk away with this like amazing knowledge of Canadian history, but the reality is that may not be the case. And what they will walk away with, hopefully, are some skills that will set them up for their world history in grade 11 or their law in grade 12 or whatever it is they happen to continue on to. So it's the disciplinary thinking stuff that the Ontario curriculum, the revised Ontario curriculum in theory has gleaned onto, but I would argue that the teachers, many of us, and certainly the colleagues that I'm sitting with here today and speaking today with, have already been doing that work in terms of disciplinary thinking. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how we encourage intermediate students to do history. So the sort of four main things that I identified in terms of sort of a checklist for myself. My students must sort of go through this process, and I have to work through this process in order for them to get to that stage. And it doesn't have to take an entire semester. It can happen really in the first month or the first month and a half or so, but to build them into a place where they're ready to really dig into inquiry, which is the ultimate goal here. So I'm going to talk a bit about how to encourage academic risk-taking, using diagnostics to identify skill gaps, skills and their gaps in terms of their skills in particular, using varied and alternative sources, so appealing to them where they are and what they're already sort of, experiencing in the outside world, outside of sort of the box of the classroom, and then getting to the place where students are doing the work of historians and not just simply being like receptacles for whatever story I want to tell them. So the first is academic risk-taking. The problem that we have is that students are often impeded by their fear of failure and their limited background knowledge. They come in with sort of that paradigm of I don't know anything or I only know about one thing, and that's because they happen to be particularly interested in that one area, whatever that might be. For a lot of my students, that might be a war. Wars are definitely very much popular still. It might be one time period, so we definitely look to the ancient world. Some of the students come in with a lot of knowledge and in the area of like Greek or Roman history, something like that. They just have like an interest in one thing. So they either don't know anything or they only want to know about one thing. So I really think the first job of a history teacher then is to build students' confidence and their interest by encouraging academic risk-taking, because sometimes this will freeze your students up, and I found that especially with intermediate students, and that partially is connected to the fact that in elementary school, depending on how much time in grade 7 and 8 they spent on history, they really feel like they came in with like nothing, and they don't have to know any of that, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's lovely if they do, but they don't actually have to know any of that to start in 1914 where our curriculum actually begins. So we need to get them into that mind frame. So what I do with my students is show them in the first day that they actually know quite a bit. So these are pieces of chart paper, and all the little yellow things and bits and papers are sticky notes. And what we do in the first couple of days is sort of redefine history in broader terms. We stop thinking about history in sort of a very narrow definition that they may have experienced again in their elementary school life. And it's not the fault of the elementary school teachers. My husband's a 7 and 8 teacher, and so I can't just throw them under the bus. It is part of the curriculum that they are asked to deliver. It's part of the fact that many people are not specialists in history. Most are not specialists in history. Their passion doesn't lay there, and they have a curriculum that is just ginormous, and they have to cover all of this. So anyways, we start to redefine history in sort of a number of different categories. So we come up with definitions for what would be cultural history, what would be social history, science and technology, military, political, economic history. And the students just start to brainstorm using a couple different strategies, things that they think would fall into those categories. And so, within half an hour, we had, I think here there's like 197 things brainstormed up here. We counted them because we thought that number mattered, and it kind of does matter, right? Because these are 15-year-olds who are coming in saying, I don't know anything, and really in, 30 minutes, they're able to come up with 197 different things that they think actually like qualify as historically relevant under the categories. So this could be like a good starting place, but the next point of this is that I want them to then be able to start to make cross connections between these categories, because of course no person or event or anything is isolated within any one of these categories of history. So we start to develop the idea of sort of rich examples and being able to explain a historical topic that they knew very little about, or only know sort of a little bit about, and trying to connect it to different categories. So from there we go and they make mind maps where they categorize and explain an example of something they've brainstormed, and then they connect it to another category or multiple categories, right? So yeah, this kid is super artistic and she's amazing. I am inspired by her. They don't all look like this, but I in terms of my academic, my applied, my locally developed students, so students at all academic levels, they can all be successful in this task because, and I do it with all of those classes for exactly that purpose, because they do start to be able to see how an event that might seem entirely military based, so a war, actually connects to multiple different areas of life, and so we start to have those conversations. So this one here looks different because this young lady, she said she was like, I hate mind maps. So she instead, which is fine, so she started creating Post-it notes that she stuck on top that were all of the different areas that she could see them connect to other categories, right? So this is, like I said, this could be your first 2 days in class, and all of a sudden everybody's feeling like they're kind of on the same, they can tell the kid who knows a lot about one thing because that guy wants to talk about the same topic, and the history kids definitely will come out and you'll be able to identify them as a teacher, but we're all kind of on the same playing field here because now our definition of history is broader. Things that we might have interest in or know about are definitely valued in this class, and so that's part of the big conversation. And for them getting to start to see themselves in history and their interest in history is really what the motivation is there, right? So the next for me as a teacher is using the diagnostics to really identify what skills they have or what gaps they have. And of course we know, we're involved in history, so we know there's a lot of skills attached to history that are far more paramount at this stage, especially early in the semester, than the content, because they can't get to the content, they can't do anything with it if they have these skill gaps. And anytime we present students with content or challenges that are too far beyond where they are currently, we are definitely risking them just backing off completely. I happen to teach in an area of London with a large population of at-risk students, a high population of academically disengaged students, and so the more that I can engage them and make them feel comfortable and actually identify their skill sets, the better, because they're going to come back and they're going to get engaged in history, and so the long-term outcomes are much more significant. So there's a number of complex skills we know: question development, finding sources, critical reading and research, using specific evidence to support an opinion, identifying perspective and bias. The list goes on. These are some that are clearly identified within our curriculum. And so I want to identify and help students identify themselves which skill sets that they need to work on, because this is individual to students. There are some common things that come up amongst the group, and I'll talk about those in a sec. But also explicitly teaching the skills required for success. The presumption of prior knowledge is something that many teachers are aware of, but the presumption of prior skills are something that is, we can't assume that they can use the internet effectively, for example, because they can't. They know how to Google a question, they don't know how to Google search terms, and so that's heavily problematic. And so that's something that we need to be very cognizant of. So for this example, this is, I did this with all of my classes, so a grade 10 applied, grade 10 academic, and grade 12 world history class. And 9/11, so let's do some stuff on 9/11. This topic is totally irrelevant. It could be plugged out, but definitely something for this strategy that it would work best if it's something the kids have curiosity about. And curiosity is definitely what we're trying to inspire here, and so if they have curiosity about a particular topic, this will work for it. So basically, individually, the students develop questions that they want to know more about. And we start with what do we already know about this topic? My grade 10s, were born in the year 2000, so their whole world, everything they really know is a post 9/11 context, right? So they don't understand what it was like before that happened. They just understand this world. So we talk about what we already know, what we know but we kind of want to fact check because it might not be okay, you know, and then things that we definitely need to have answered. And so then I take all of that in order to make it a little bit more collaborative. I look at their questions, and first of all, I look for like, you know, red flags of I know this for sure, and it's like glaringly problematic, and so we discuss some of those misconceptions. I, you know, answer any questions or things that need clarification, but then I take their questions and I reduce them down to say 5 or 6 that will work for the whole class. So then each kid gets to pick which question they want to research. They individually do research, except we're doing it on Google Docs and Google Classroom, so they're actually collaborating on the research at the same time. They're able to check and see if somebody has already found that piece of information, etc. And then the next day they come in and I give them information that another group researched. So now they have to read the question, read the research that has come about, and they write a brief summary of that research that answers the question, and they also identify new questions that they might have based on what gaps were left. So this process, then we obviously do a discuss and debrief. Again, it's like 2 periods, so a period of question development research, a period the next day doing the debrief. But what I'm able to come up with, and this is this year with these particular grade 10s, they struggled with question development. Like they were writing statements, they weren't writing questions. So I can't get to inquiry if they don't know how to ask questions. So we need to do question development. They were comfortable with using technology. I got them all signed into my Google Classroom in like 5 minutes for the first time. I was like, yay, so we can use the internet, at least in that form. But many struggled with finding sources that had real academic merit, so it was the first, not best sort of mentality. They'd use the first source they find instead of looking deeper. They worked well in small groups. That was good for me to know because I have a class of 31, so I need to know that I can actually put them in small groups. And the big thing was that they struggled significantly with summarizing, research, and critical reading skills, like really problematic there. So what that means for me is that if I want them to be able to do history, I need to be now a teacher of reading. And I know that seems crazy because we're dealing with 15-year-olds, but that is the biggest struggle right now, is that we have kids coming to us ill-prepared to deal with grade level, let alone below grade level reading. And yes, there are lots of different ways to get to history without reading, but it's really tough, and they're not going to get as much out of it if they can't read rigorously and work their way through tough sort of written pieces. So we do a number of strategies. We ask students, this is the say something strategy I use. They have to annotate text, they get to ask questions here, and so we start to practice the skills of being critical readers. So again, this is how skills associate with history. They can't get to the big thinking until they can do that. So that's how I'm feeling about my students right now, right? And this is the world that they live in, and I feel like as a teacher, this is the world I live in, because there's so much coming at me, there's so much information out there, and I even have a hard time filtering what it is that I want to put in front of my students, let alone them making those decisions. So the next is using the various sources that we have available to us in a really meaningful way. So we're often confronted with too many sources, and that's the reality of the world that the students live in, but we also have to recognize that we gotta move beyond the textbook. In fact, let's be honest, in Ontario, they're not even making new textbooks for some of our courses anymore because they're just becoming antiquated. They're going a digital route, and so, I mean, we need to move beyond that, and we need to be comfortable doing that. And I'll be honest, some teachers, and history teachers in particular, are not comfortable moving beyond the textbook. That's a statement. I love my colleagues, but that's just the reality. So textbooks aren't the sources our students are encountering in the real life. They are encountering these kinds of sources. And so this goes to a project that I've been working on for a number of years with my students, which is asking them to evaluate, assess, and really critically analyze the kinds of sources that they might come in contact to in their real life related to some of the topics that we might study in grade 10 Canadian history. So obviously we've got sort of a D-Day focus here, but this is not just exclusive to D-Day. We ask students to do this in a number of different areas. And the ultimate outcome of this is that then students take these sources, they analyze them using some criteria, so reliability, ease of use, educational value, etc. And then ultimately they end up creating their own sources that then would be useful for a grade 10 student from a Canadian perspective. Because the one thing you might notice here is that a lot of these sources are going to ultimately have a very Americanized perspective. So we need to shift this now into sort of the Canadian dialogue and Canadian perspective. So they might create prisoner of war diaries. These ones are an extension because what they're actually using as their jumping off point for their source that they create is a primary source. So they seek out a primary source and they use that as their inspiration. This one here, they actually were using a Hitler Youth propaganda poster and creating some work and then doing comics, etc. So from a Canadian perspective. And then the last is they get to the point of doing history as, as far as I'm concerned, what historians do, which is going to the primary sources, asking questions and coming up with their own answers. So this approach, I would say, just as with the simulation, greater content retention, if that's your priority, but also more authentic demonstration of the historical thinking concepts, because they're actually doing the work of a historian now. And these are transferable then to our grade 11 courses. And let's get outside of education to life. Like they could actually think critically. Woo, good news. So what we do is develop a class question for investigation, and sometimes I provide the material for students, the primary sources, depends on the class, depends on their skill set, or they provide them themselves. And then we go to, for example, doing evidence boards, where they have a series of questions that they need to answer about a particular battle. They then find the sources. They might have 30 sources available to them, and they pick 5 or 10 that actually help them answer the questions, and they have to clearly show in the sources where they got their information. So now they are demonstrating their ability to do actual history instead of simply just being the receptacles of the story that I want to tell them. So that's it. There you go.
Thank you. I hope everyone will join me in thanking our 3 panelists today. And a quick another round for thanking everybody for coming out today.
Thanks,
and enjoying
guys.
this session.
Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.